Cowboy saw Apache cast out of camp and the raven above promised justice before dawn. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main story. John Miller, a lone cowboy, stood on a rocky ridge overlooking the camp below. His eyes, hard and steady, scanned the scene unfolding before him. It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dry plains. John had lived a solitary life for years, but today, his solitude was interrupted by something he could not ignore. Below, a group of Apache, led by a tall man with a stern expression, was being forced from their camp by the local settlers. The men of the settlement stood in a group, shouting, pushing the Apache with crude force. They had no regard for the traditions or humanity of the tribe. John had seen many things during his years on the frontier, but this felt different. It was a sight he couldn't ignore. He watched as the Apache man, his face weathered by the harsh desert winds, looked back at his people, his eyes filled with the silent sorrow of a father who could do nothing to protect his family. The scene seemed to stretch on forever, and in the distance, the cry of a raven echoed across the plain. The bird's call was sharp and eerie, cutting through the tension in the air. John didn't know much about omens, but there was something about the raven that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The bird circled overhead, its dark wings slicing through the fading sunlight. It felt like a message, a promise. John had seen enough injustice in his life to know that what was happening below him was wrong. As the settlers continued their cruel expulsion, he felt a sense of resolve settle in his chest. He could no longer stand by and watch. The raven, still circling above, seemed to beckon him forward. A silent witness to the promise of justice that was yet to come. John tightened his grip on the reins of his horse and rode down the hill toward the camp. The sounds of shouting grew louder as he approached, but he was calm. He had a job to do. The raven, circling ever closer, seemed to follow his every move, its black wings a stark contrast against the setting sun. As he reached the bottom of the hill, John saw the Apache man look up at him. For a moment, their eyes met, and in that instant, John knew what he had to do. The promise of justice was in his hands now, and he would see it through before dawn broke over the horizon. John Miller approached the camp slowly, his horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust with each deliberate step. The sun had almost set now, leaving the sky painted with shades of orange and purple, the kind of sunset that made the world feel endless. But beneath that beauty, something darker was unfolding. As he neared the edge of the camp, he could hear the voices of the settlers grow louder, filled with anger and pride, as they pushed the Apache further away from their home. The Apache man, whose face John had seen moments ago, was still standing tall despite the hardship, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His people, broken and defeated, gathered their belongings in silence, but there was a fierce pride in their quiet. John felt a knot form in his stomach. He couldn't stand by any longer. He could hear the raven's call again, a sharp reminder that the time for action was now. John dismounted, his boots landing softly on the dry earth. He didn't know what he expected to happen when he walked into this camp, but he wasn't about to turn back. As he moved closer to the Apache man, the others began to notice him. The settlers eyed him warily, but John held his ground. He could feel the tension in the air as the two sides, so different yet bound by the same land, waited for someone to speak. The Apache man turned, his eyes meeting John's once again. This time, there was a flicker of recognition, something silent but understood. John didn't need to say a word. The Apache man nodded slightly, as if giving him permission to join in this moment of reckoning. And then, just as the first star appeared in the sky above, John stepped forward. "You've seen enough," John said, his voice low but steady. "This is wrong, and it's going to stop tonight." The settlers muttered amongst themselves, unsure of what to do, but John's presence commanded attention. He wasn't just another cowboy looking to keep to himself. He was a man who had witnessed injustice, and he wasn't afraid to call it out. The raven's call echoed once more, louder now, as if urging him on. John could feel the weight of the promise in the air. This was a moment that would change things. The Apache man looked at him, his expression unreadable, but John could see the gratitude behind his eyes. The rest of the Apache tribe, silent until now, began to stand taller, their spirits unbroken by the settlers' cruelty. John wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew this was just the beginning. The raven above had promised justice, and with that promise, John would make sure that justice was delivered before dawn broke over the horizon. The night stretched ahead, uncertain but full of possibilities. It was the kind of night that would shape the future, a night when a single act of courage could change the course of history. The night air was cool, and the land around John Miller's camp felt oddly still, like the calm before a storm. He could hear the soft rustling of the wind as it passed through the dry grass, carrying with it the scent of dust and sage. John stood near the edge of the camp, watching as the Apache began to gather their things. The settlers, who had been the source of the oppression earlier in the day, now stood off to the side, unsure of what to do next. They hadn't expected the cowboy to take a stand. The Apache man, the one who had first caught John's attention, was now standing a few paces away from him, his posture strong despite the hardship. His people had been humiliated, but the spark of resistance still burned in his eyes. John knew the moment had come, and it wasn't just about standing up for the Apache. It was about standing up for what was right. John walked over to the Apache man, his boots kicking up soft clouds of dust as he moved. The man's gaze met his once more, and this time, there was no fear, only a silent understanding. "I won't let them do this to you," John said quietly. "Not again." The Apache man nodded but didn't speak. Words weren't always necessary. The silent agreement between them was enough. The settlers watched in silence, unsure of what John meant or what he planned to do. But John didn't care. He wasn't here for their approval. He was here because he couldn't let this injustice stand. As the darkness deepened, the raven above them let out a sharp call. John looked up, and for a brief moment, he could have sworn he saw the bird's eyes lock with his. The promise of justice that had hung in the air since that first cry seemed to grow stronger, and John knew that things were about to change. He motioned for the Apache man to follow him. Together, they walked toward the settlers, their faces now set with determination. The settlers shifted uneasily, but none of them moved. They weren't sure what John intended, but they could sense the tension in the air. "It's over," John said, his voice calm but firm. "The days of you forcing them out are done. You will not harm these people anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with authority. The leader of the settlers, a tall man with a weathered face, stepped forward. His hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but John's steady gaze stopped him before he could make a move. "We don't want any trouble," the man said, his voice wavering slightly. "Trouble?" John asked, his tone sharp. "You've caused nothing but trouble. But that ends now." The silence stretched for a long moment. The raven's call echoed once more, as if to punctuate John's words. The Apache man, standing beside John, didn't say a word, but his presence alone was enough. The tension in the air seemed to crackle, like the calm before a thunderstorm. Just then, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. John turned his head, his eyes scanning the horizon. A group of riders appeared, moving swiftly across the plain. It wasn't just any group. It was a small band of Apache warriors, their faces painted with the signs of their people. They had come to stand by the Apache, to show their support, and to bring the promise of justice that had been promised earlier by the raven. The settlers, now realizing the gravity of the situation, began to back away. They had no choice but to face the reality that the balance of power had shifted. The Apache had come to claim their dignity, their land, and their future. And with that, John Miller knew that his role in this story wasn't just as an observer. He had become a part of something larger, something more significant than himself. The raven's call echoed once more in the distance, and as the warriors rode into the camp, John felt the weight of the promise fulfilled. Justice, it seemed, had been delivered before the first light of dawn. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the stillness of the night began to fade, and with it, the tension that had gripped the camp. The Apache warriors, led by their chief, now stood in full view, their presence commanding respect and attention. The riders who had once been part of the settlers' group now found themselves surrounded by a power they had underestimated. The chief, tall and dignified, stepped forward, his face unwavering as he approached John Miller. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. The chief had come not only to reclaim what had been wrongfully taken but to ensure that justice would be honored in the most sacred way possible. John Miller stood beside him, not as a bystander, but as a man who had witnessed too much injustice to stay silent any longer. The promise that had been made by the raven was now unfolding before them. The settlers, who had once been so sure of their place in this land, now seemed small in the presence of those who had lived on this land long before them. The morning light glinted off the weapons of the Apache warriors, but there was no threat in the air. Instead, there was a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. The leader of the settlers, who had been the one to push the Apache from their camp the day before, now stood with his back against the fence, unsure of how to proceed. His hand rested nervously on the hilt of his gun, but even he knew that today was not a day for violence. The power had shifted, and the balance had been restored. The Apache chief turned to the settlers, his voice calm but firm. "You have violated the peace of this land. You have cast out those who belong here, but no longer will you make such decisions." His words were measured, each one landing with the weight of truth. John stood silently beside him, watching the settlers as they processed the words that had just been spoken. The raven's call still echoed faintly in the distance, a reminder of the promise fulfilled. The settlers, now realizing the gravity of the situation, began to retreat, their once strong positions crumbling in the face of the truth. They had no choice but to leave. The Apache had claimed their land, and no man could stand against the will of those who had lived there for generations. As the settlers gathered their things and began to depart, John turned to the Apache man who had once been cast out of his own camp. There was a quiet understanding between them now. What had begun as an act of defiance had transformed into something greater, a moment of reconciliation, of reclaiming what had been lost. The Apache man looked at John, his face softening. "You have shown us a kindness we will never forget," he said, his voice low but full of gratitude. John nodded, his gaze steady. "It was the right thing to do," he replied simply. The warriors mounted their horses, ready to leave the camp they had reclaimed. As the chief and his warriors rode off into the distance, John stayed behind for a moment, watching the landscape stretch out before him. He felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that justice had been served. The raven's call echoed one last time as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the land. It was a new day, a day where the scales had finally been balanced, and the promise of justice had been fulfilled. As the days passed since the dawn of justice, the camp remained peaceful, a quiet reminder of the promise fulfilled. John Miller had stayed longer than he intended, feeling a strange pull to the land and the people who had reclaimed it. The Apache had rebuilt their camp, not out of defiance, but out of a deep-rooted need to return to what was rightfully theirs. The land had been harsh to them, but it had always been home. The settlers, now gone, had scattered, their hold over the land broken like a brittle branch snapped in the wind. John had not expected to find such peace, but in the days following, he saw the Apache people rise again, not with anger, but with the quiet dignity that had been theirs long before the arrival of settlers. John found himself visiting them daily, not as a savior, but as a witness to something much greater than himself. The Apache chief, the man who had once been cast out, had now become a symbol of resilience. His name was Dakota, and his eyes reflected the wisdom of 1,000 lifetimes. He had lived through hardships that John could not even begin to imagine, and yet he remained unbroken. Dakota would often sit with John by the campfire, the two men sharing silence as they watched the flames dance in the night. "You have seen much," Dakota said one evening, his voice deep and steady. But you have not seen all of us. There is more to our people than what you have witnessed. John nodded, understanding that his presence here had only scratched the surface of a much deeper story. He knew that he could never truly understand the full depth of what the Apache had endured, but he was beginning to see it in their eyes. The following morning, as the sun rose over the mountains, the camp was stirred by the arrival of a lone figure riding toward them. It was a woman, her face painted with the intricate designs of her tribe, and her eyes held the same fire that John had seen in Takota's. She dismounted gracefully and approached the chief. "Takota," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of authority. "The time has come." Takota stood, his expression unreadable as he met her gaze. "Yes," he replied simply. The woman turned to John, her eyes studying him for a moment before she spoke. "You have been a witness to our justice," she said. "But now, you must see what comes next." John was unsure of what she meant, but he nodded, his curiosity piqued. Takota turned to John and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have earned the right to witness this," he said. The woman led them both to the center of the camp, where a large fire burned brightly. A group of Apache warriors had gathered, their faces solemn but resolute. As they arrived, the woman raised her hand, signaling for silence. The warriors fell into line, their gazes fixed on the fire. Takota stepped forward, his voice carrying across the camp. "Today, we honor our ancestors," he said, his words reverberating in the stillness. "We honor those who fought to protect this land, who fought to protect us. And we honor the justice that has been brought to us, by our own hands and by the hands of those who understand our struggle." John felt a shiver run down his spine as the fire crackled. The moment was heavy with meaning, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Takota turned to the warriors, nodding to each one in turn. "We will remember," he said. "We will remember the sacrifices made, and we will remember that this land is ours. And no one, no matter their skin or their name, will ever take it from us again." The warriors raised their fists in silent agreement, and the camp was filled with a deep sense of unity. The raven, who had circled above them on that fateful day, was now gone, but its promise lingered in the hearts of the Apache. Justice had been served, and the land had been returned. As the fire burned down to embers, John stood with Takota and the others, feeling the weight of the moment. He had witnessed something profound, something that transcended his own understanding. He had witnessed a people reclaiming their dignity, their land, and their future. As the days turned into weeks, John Miller found himself becoming a part of the Apache camp in a way he had not expected. He spent his mornings walking with Takota, learning more about the land and its history, about the traditions and stories of the Apache people. In the evenings, he sat by the fire, listening to the warriors share tales of their ancestors and their battles, their victories, and their losses. It was during one of these evenings that Takota spoke to him in a way he had never before. "You have become more than a witness, John," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of something deeper. "You have earned our trust, and you have earned your place here, not because of what you have done, but because of what you have seen." John was silent for a moment, processing Takota's words. He had come here with no intention of staying, no thought of becoming a part of something much larger than himself. But now, as he sat by the fire, surrounded by the Apache people, he realized that this was exactly where he needed to be. "I never expected to be part of something like this," John admitted, his voice low. "I came here because I couldn't stand to watch injustice. But now I feel like I belong." Takota nodded, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "You belong because you see the truth," he said simply. "And you are not afraid to stand up for it." The days grew longer, and the bond between John and the Apache people deepened. He learned their ways, their language, their customs, and in turn, they came to see him not as an outsider, but as one of their own. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, John stood at the edge of the camp, looking out over the vast expanse of land that stretched before him. He had spent countless hours here, watching the changes in the land as the seasons shifted. The winds carried the scent of the earth, the grasses, and the distant mountains. It was a feeling of peace that he had never known before. Takoda approached him, standing quietly beside him for a moment before speaking. "The land is not just dirt and rock, John," he said. "It is a living thing. It has its own spirit, its own heart. And we are part of that spirit." John turned to look at Takoda, his face reflecting the understanding that had begun to settle within him. "I can feel it," he said. "It's different here, different from anything I've ever known." Takoda smiled, the kind of smile that spoke of years of wisdom, of knowing the land in a way that few others ever would. "It is good that you feel it," he said. "But there is still much for you to learn." Over the next few weeks, Takoda began teaching John more than just the ways of the Apache. He taught him how to listen to the land, to feel the changes in the wind, to read the signs in the trees and the animals. John's connection to the land deepened, and in that connection, he found a sense of peace that he had been searching for all his life. One evening, as the stars began to twinkle above them, Takoda sat next to John by the fire. "The time is coming," Takoda said quietly. "The time when we must return to our people, to our homes. But we will not leave the land behind. It will always be with us." John nodded, understanding the weight of Takoda's words. He had come to know this land as his own, to feel its heartbeat in a way he had never imagined. "I will never forget this place," John said, his voice filled with resolve. Takoda looked at him, his expression serious. "And you will always be welcome here," he said. "For you are one of us now." The fire crackled between them, its warmth a symbol of the bond they had forged. The raven's call echoed in the distance, a reminder that the promises made in the darkness had been fulfilled, and that the land, like the people, had found its justice. As the night deepened, John felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had come here looking for something, and in the Apache, he had found not just justice, but a family, a place, and a purpose he had never expected. And with that, he knew he had found his home. As the days turned into weeks, the Apache camp began to settle into a quiet rhythm. The promise of justice had been fulfilled, but there was still much to be done. John Miller, now fully immersed in their way of life, found peace in the simplicity of his new life. Every morning, he would wake up to the soft murmur of the wind and the scent of fresh earth, a stark contrast to the lonely, harsh existence he had once known. He had become part of something bigger, something grounded in respect for the land and its people. Takoda, the Apache chief, had taken him under his wing, not just as a protector of the land, but as a teacher. Takoda often spoke to John about the spirit of the earth, how everything was connected, the trees, the animals, the rivers, and the people. John had come to understand that the land was not just a place to live but a living entity that demanded respect, not ownership. As the Apache settled in their reclaimed land, they began to rebuild. The tents were erected with care, the fires were lit with purpose, and the laughter of children echoed through the camp. Despite their hardships, there was a sense of renewal in the air. The strength of their ancestors seemed to pulse through every action they took. One day, as John sat by the fire with Takoda, the older man spoke to him with a seriousness that John had not heard before. "The settlers are gone, but that does not mean the struggles are over," Takoda said. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of years spent in the struggle. "The world is changing, and there will be others who seek to take what is ours. But we will not back down. We never have." John nodded, understanding that while the Apache had won this battle, the war for their land and their rights was far from over. "What can I do to help?" John asked, the words coming out before he had fully processed them. Takoda looked at him, his eyes sharp with understanding. "You have already done more than you know," he said quietly. "You have shown us that even in a world filled with injustice, there is still room for good. But there will be others who need to learn what we have learned. There will be those who need a guiding hand." John wasn't sure what Takoda meant, but he felt the weight of the words. He had come here as an outsider, a man who had wandered into a world not his own. But now, he was part of the tribe. He had earned his place among them. The next day, as John helped the Apache rebuild their camp, he noticed a shift in the air. The winds had changed, and with it, the land seemed to hold its breath. Dakota had always said that the earth spoke to those who listened, and now, John found himself listening more carefully. That night, as the camp gathered around the fire, Dakota stood before them, his presence commanding attention. "We are not alone," Dakota said, his voice carrying over the quiet murmurs of the camp. "The land is ours, but there are those who still seek to take it. We must be ready." John felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard rumors of unrest in nearby settlements, whispers of those who sought to take back what they had lost. But he had never imagined it would come to this. "What do we do?" John asked, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. Dakota's gaze never wavered. "We stand together," he said simply. "We fight not with weapons, but with our unity. The land will always be ours if we protect it with everything we have." The fire crackled, and for a moment the camp was silent. John could feel the weight of Dakota's words. The promise of justice had been fulfilled, but now they were entering a new chapter. A chapter where survival would depend not just on their strength, but on their ability to hold fast to the values that had brought them this far. The dawn was still hours away, but as the stars twinkled above, John Miller knew that this new fight would not be like the last. It would be a fight of endurance, of patience, and most importantly, of faith in one another. And for the first time in years, John felt ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed were filled with an unsettling calm. The Apache camp, though now secure, felt the weight of the uncertainty in the air. Dakota, the chief, had warned them that there were forces at play beyond their control. John Miller, still adjusting to his new life among the Apache, couldn't help but sense that something was on the horizon, something that would test the strength of their unity. John spent his days walking the land, learning the rhythms of the earth as Dakota had taught him. There was a beauty in it that he had never known, a connection to the land that went beyond mere survival. The wind whispered through the trees, and the distant mountains stood tall, watching over the camp. John had learned to listen to them, to feel the subtle changes in the air. He had come to understand that the Apache weren't just protecting the land, they were part of it. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, Dakota gathered the tribe around the fire. His face, weathered by time and the hardships of his people, was serious as he looked out over them. "The time has come," Dakota said, his voice steady. "The settlers may be gone, but the fight for our land is far from over. There are those who would still take it from us. We must be ready." John, who had been sitting at the edge of the fire, felt a sense of urgency stir within him. The Apache had fought for their land once before, and it seemed that they would have to fight again. Dakota looked at him then, his gaze sharp. "You have been a part of our journey, John," Dakota said, his voice low but filled with meaning. "And now you must stand with us." John felt the weight of his words. He had come to this land seeking something: peace, justice, maybe even redemption. And now, he realized that his place here wasn't just about what he had received, but about what he could give. "I'll stand with you," John said, his voice steady. "I'll stand with you until the end." The fire crackled as the Apache warriors looked at one another, their faces calm but resolute. They had endured so much, and yet, they remained unbroken. Their spirit was as strong as the land they had fought for, and they would not let it go without a fight. As the night grew darker, John felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. There was still uncertainty, yes, but there was also something more powerful: hope. Hope that no matter what challenges lay ahead, the Apache would face them together. The next morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Dakota called for a meeting. The tribe gathered, their faces serious but resolute. Dakota spoke of the coming days, of the challenges they would face, and of the strength they would need to overcome them. John listened intently, understanding that this was no longer just about defending a piece of land. This was about preserving a way of life, a culture, and a people who had lived for generations in harmony with the earth. As the meeting concluded, Dakota turned to John. "The time is now," he said. "The land calls for us, and we must answer." John nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose. He had come to this land seeking something he couldn't quite name, but now he knew. He had found it in the Apache, in their strength, their resilience, and their connection to the land. It was a bond that could never be broken, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. As the tribe prepared for what was to come, John felt ready. He wasn't just a witness anymore. He was a part of this, a part of something much larger than himself. And as he looked out over the land, he knew that together, they would face whatever came next, with courage, unity, and the unshakable belief that justice would prevail. As the days passed, John Miller found himself once again standing at the edge of the Apache camp, watching the horizon stretch endlessly before him. The land, now calm and quiet, had become his home, though he still felt the weight of the promise he had made to Dakota. The promise to protect the land, to stand with the Apache, and to never let injustice take root again. He had learned much since he first rode into their camp. He had learned to listen to the wind, to understand the language of the earth, and most importantly, to recognize that his place in the world was not just as a bystander, but as an active participant in the fight for what was right. Dakota, ever watchful, had become not just a leader, but a father figure to him. They shared many silent moments together, watching the fire burn down to embers or standing at the edge of the camp, watching the stars appear in the sky. But there was always a sense of anticipation in the air. The quiet before the storm. One evening, as the sun set and the fire crackled, Dakota spoke once more, his voice carrying the weight of everything he had seen in his life. "John," he said, "the world is changing, and there will be those who will not rest until they take what is ours. But we will not allow them to succeed. The land belongs to us, and we will fight to keep it." John felt the strength of Dakota's words resonate deep within him. He had known this fight was coming, but hearing it from Dakota made it all the more real. "I'm with you, Dakota," John replied, his voice steady. "I always will be." The next morning, the air was thick with the promise of something significant. Dakota had gathered the warriors once more, and there was a quiet urgency in the air. John stood beside him, knowing that this time, they would not simply be defending their land, they would be defending their very way of life. The camp was ready, the warriors prepared, and John could feel the pulse of the land beneath his feet, as if it, too, was ready. Dakota turned to the gathered warriors, his eyes filled with resolve. "We have fought for this land before," he said, his voice carrying across the camp. "And we will fight for it again, not because we are angry, but because we must. This is our land, and we will protect it with everything we have." John stood tall beside Dakota, knowing that the fight ahead was not just about land. It was about freedom, dignity, and the survival of their people. The settlers who had once driven them away now stood in opposition once more. John could feel the tension in the air as the warriors mounted their horses, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun had risen fully now, casting its golden light over the land. John looked out at the vast expanse before him, feeling both a sense of determination and a deep, unshakable peace. This was not just a battle for land, it was a battle for the future. And together, with Dakota and the Apache people by his side, John knew they could face anything. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the strength of generations past. The raven's call echoed in the distance, as if reminding them all that justice, like the land, would always endure. Dakota glanced at John, a silent understanding passing between them. "It is time," Dakota said. "Let us move forward together." As the warriors rode out, the camp was left in a heavy silence, the kind that comes before a great change. The land was still. The air was thick with anticipation. And in the distance, John could hear the sound of hooves, the sound of justice riding towards them, just as it had before. The battle ahead would not be easy, but John Miller was ready. The Apache were ready. And together they would protect the land, their home, and the promise of justice that had been made to them long ago.